Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I was so far off, wasn't I? The other day, the Booker Prize longlist for 2021 was announced. A couple of weeks ago, I put up a video with my predictions for what I thought would make the list and some books that I hoped would make the list. It didn't go well. Honestly, I could have been talking about a different year. This year's longlist was a surprise to me, as it has been for quite a few people, I think. I wasn't actually sure that I was going to make this video. I didn't feel particularly inspired to, but then I thought, that's interesting in itself. I don't have to love the look of a list to talk about it, so here we are. We're going to talk overall thoughts, we're going to talk about the books one by one, starting with the ones that I don't care about at all and working up to the ones that I am interested in. Let's get into this. So as you may have gathered by now, this list does not excite me. There are so many books that I am shocked to not see on this list, and the books that are on this list, meh. Before we go on, I do want to say that I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this list. Let me know down below, do you like the look of the list? Are you confused by it? Does it leave you feeling cold and soulless inside, like it may be doing for some other people? So a few stats. 13 books on the long list, 7 books by men, 6 by women. Authors from America and Britain, most prominently. 4 books by Americans, I think. We also have authors from South Africa and Sri Lanka and Canada. No authors from Ireland or Australia, which are 2 particularly surprising ones. We are massively dominated by the big publishers on this list, specifically Penguin Random House. This isn't unusual and honestly doesn't shock me too much, but this list is so Penguin Random House heavy, it's honestly a bit boring to me. You're telling me that half of all the best fiction published in the past year was published by Penguin Random House. Obviously they publish some amazing things that deserve to be on this list, but really, where is the range? Where are the indies? Things desperately need opening up. The surprises on here in terms of publishing houses are 1 book by an indie called Holland House Books, and then another book from Granta as well. Before we get into the list, let's quickly acknowledge the books that didn't make it. Obviously, it's pretty shocking that the new Sally Rooney didn't make it. The new Pat Barker, possibly The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., Assembly by Natasha Brown. But really, where is the Yarjiassi? Where is she? I am shocked that she didn't make it and quite upset. Also, my personal biggest wish didn't make it onto the list. The new Sarah Winman. She is sublime, one of the best writers of our time, and she really, really deserves the recognition. Do you guys agree with me? Was this list a massive shock to you? What are the books that you think should have made it? So moving on to the books that did make it onto the list, of those, I've only read 1. I own a couple more and I've heard of a couple more on top of that. But really, there are a good few books on this list that I hadn't even heard of before the list was announced. Obviously, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but from looking into these books, they don't really interest me too much. For whatever reason, this list as a whole doesn't excite me. I'm actually kind of struggling to think of things to say. There are a few individual books that I'm interested in reading, and there's only 1 that I am actively excited about. I'm going to be ruthless this year. I am not going to read anything that I'm not interested in. In the past, I have given books a go solely due to the fact that they've made it onto long lists. That hasn't always gone well for me. Earlier this year, when the Women's Prize Longlist was announced, I decided that I was going to change my approach to longlist reading. I was only going to read books that actively interested me, that I would read outside of the prize. Because let's be honest, I have tons of new releases and backlist books that do those things for me. So why would I waste my time elsewhere? Especially when I have been burned by books on both the Women's Prize and the Booker Prize longlists in the past. Essentially, I'm just being true to my reading tastes, which I know pretty well, and there are only a handful of books on this list that I'm going to bother reading. Let's talk about them. So firstly, I'm going to whiz through the books that I'm not interested in reading, and then we will get to the better end of things. Firstly, there is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. This one is published by Doubleday, Transworld, Penguin Random House. This is by an American author set in America. I believe there are two timelines, one focusing on a woman around World War I. She wants to become an aviator, and the other is set over a century later when a film crew is wanting to make a film about this young woman's disappearance. I don't like World War I novels. I just don't. They're not my thing. Aviation here is not helping the whole thing out. Pass. Next up is Light Perpetual by Frances Spufford. This is published by Faber and Faber. This one is set during the Second World War in London, and it tells the story of 5 young lives that are lost during the war. Again, just not a time period I'm particularly interested in. There's enough wartime literature out there, isn't there? Next up is China Room by Sanjeev Sahota. This is published by Harville Secker, Vintage, Penguin Random House. This one follows the story of a young woman who lives in Punjab in the 1920s. I believe she is married to 3 men with 2 other women in a single ceremony. There's then another storyline set in 1999 when a man travels from England to his native India to learn about his family. I am intrigued by Sanjeev Sahota as an author. He is a British author. He obviously wrote The Year of the Runaways, but the sound of this one just isn't really doing it for me. I like the sound of the storyline focusing in on the women much more than I like the sound of the storyline focusing on the man in the 90s. Honestly, that kind of killed it for me. Next up is A Passage North by Anuk Aradpragasam. This one is published by Granta, and they are a Sri Lankan author. I believe it follows the story of a man who travels across Sri Lanka up to the war-torn north for the funeral of his grandmother's caretaker. I am interested in reading some Sri Lankan literature at some point, but really nothing about this one in particular is intriguing me, so there we go. Next up is The Promise by Damon Galgut. This is published by Chatham & Windus, Vintage, Penguin Random House. Written by a South African author, this one tells the story of a privileged white South African family directly before and after apartheid. I believe it centres around a funeral and the family's relationship with their black maid. I am quickly beginning to realise that centering novels around funerals is a massive turn off for me. I don't know why. I have heard good things about this one, to be fair, but I'm not particularly excited about it for myself. And lastly in this category is An Island by Karen Jennings. This is the book published by Holland House Books. Another South African set novel and author. This is the book that most people haven't heard of on the list. I believe it tells the story of a man who goes to live out his years alone as a lighthouse keeper on an unnamed African island. Then one day a young refugee is washed ashore on the island and the 2 men are trapped together. Nothing about this premise really offends me. It's just not particularly grabbing me either. I will be interested to hear the reviews of this one come in though, the more people that read it. So now moving on to the books that I'm kind of interested in, could see myself reading, maybe, possibly. First up, we have No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. This is published by Bloomsbury. I was sent this copy of this book by the publisher when this book made it onto the Women's Prize longlist earlier in the year. It is currently on the shortlist. It's a debut novel. The premise is very strange. From what I can tell, it follows the story of a woman whose job is in social media. She spends a lot of time on social media, which she kind of views as a different realm. I don't know any more than that. I've heard a lot of people talking about it, but it never seems to get clearer. So here's the thing. I am intrigued by this book. I like that it sounds different. It is getting some pretty good reviews. I just haven't been in the headspace for this kind of experimental weird fiction recently. It's not what I've needed, it's not what I've wanted, and so I do think that I will pick this one up at some point. I just really need to be in the right mood for it. It just wouldn't go down too well in my brain right now, I don't think. Next up is The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris. This is published by Tinder Press. Headline, Hachette. This is another debut novel. I was actually sent this proof copy a few months ago. I didn't really know much about it. It's been sitting on my shelves ever since. It keeps getting pushed back in terms of priority. And then lo and behold, it made it onto the Booker Prize longlist. All I know about this one is that it follows two men who are brothers who have just become freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. I've seen a few people say that The Prophets should have made the list over this one. I don't know how similar they are, so I don't really know how fair that is. But yeah, I'm interested in this one. I'm more interested in it now. Maybe I will squeeze this one in at some point soon. Next up is The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohammed. This is published by Viking, Penguin Random House. This is one that I hadn't heard of before I saw this list, but it really interests me. Set in Cardiff, Wales in the 1950s, it tells the story of a black Somali man who is accused of a murder that he didn't commit. Something has me here. Something about the time frame, Wales, Somali culture in Wales, the exploration of a fair trial. This one's got me a little bit, and I'm looking forward to seeing the reviews coming in. And finally, moving on to the books that I am most interested in, the ones that I can see myself picking up and giving a go. Let's start with the one book that I have already read. That is Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, published by Faber and Faber. So I read this book as soon as I received a proof copy of it earlier in the year. It's a very me book. I did predict that this one would make it onto the list. I think everyone predicted that. So this one is set in some undetermined time in the future. It follows an exceptional artificial friend named Clara and the teenage girl named Josie, who she is bought for. I really liked this book. I know that Kazuo Ishiguro's prose style isn't for everyone, but I quite enjoy it. I really like the perspective here, the unreliable narrator of Clara. I really enjoy the different themes that are thrown up. It's a good read, and as the list goes, I'm happy to see it here. Next is Second Place by Rachel Cusk, also published by Faber and Faber. I believe this one follows the story of a woman who lives in a coastal region in England when she invites an artist to come and live with her in the hope that this will shine some light on her life. Rachel Cusk is an author that I have seen around and have been meaning to read for what feels like years at this point. I've heard great things about her writing. Apparently it's very distinct. It sounds very much up my street. The plot on this one doesn't particularly excite me. Nothing is screaming at me from the synopsis. I do want to read something by her at some point, so it may as well be this one. Next up is A Town Called Solace by Mary Lawson. This one is also Chatto and Windus Penguin Random House. This is a Canadian book. It is set in the 1970s and it tells the story of a young girl whose teenage sister goes missing, as well as the story of a strange man who moves in next door. Honestly, the main reason I'm interested in this book is because Mary Lawson's writing has been likened to Anne Tyler's. The cover design of this book is basically identical to Anne Tyler's, and Anne Tyler is also on the back of this book actually giving an endorsement. I adore Anne Tyler. She is one of those authors that I have read many books by, and this book definitely sounds along the same lines, like childhood memories, small town life, fractured family. This one sounds very me. And finally, the last book on the list is Bewilderment by Richard Powers. So this is the one book on the list that I am genuinely excited for. This book isn't out yet. It doesn't come out until later on in September. It is an anticipated release of mine. I was very recently sent this proof copy by the publisher. I believe it tells a story of an astrobiologist and his son who is struggling at school. That's really all I know. I believe it's going to be very character focused and very philosophical. I really want to read some Richard Powers. He is now very well known for being an amazing writer. For some reason, this one is appealing to me a lot more than the Overstory did. So hopefully I will be picking this one up very soon. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on the books on this year's Booker Longlist, and some thoughts on the longlist as a whole as well. Again, I would love to hear your thoughts on the list down below in the comments. Have you been following the prize for a while like me? Are you feeling less enamored with it now? Or are you loving it? I would genuinely love to hear. Sorry that this hasn't been the most positive of videos. I hope you found it interesting nonetheless. I will hopefully see you all soon in another video, which will be much happier, I promise. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I appreciate all of you and your time so much, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.